Welcome, dear listeners, to this cozy audiobook mystery in the timeless style of Agatha Christie. I'm delighted to present Slain Teacher at Maple Grove Orchard, a Miss Marple Death story. Join our sharp-witted elderly detective as she unravels a puzzling murder in the quaint village of St. Mary Mead. Settle in with a cup of tea and let the intrigue begin. This story unfolds over 10 chapters, each about 8 to 10 minutes when narrated. For your convenience, chapter timestamps are included. Chapter 1. The Orchard's Shadow. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the seasons turned with the gentle predictability of a well-wound clock, autumn 1952 draped the countryside in hues of amber and gold. Nestled among rolling hills and patchwork fields, the village was a tapestry of thatched cottages, cobblestone lanes, and the ever-present hum of community life. At its heart lay Maple Grove Orchard, a sprawling expanse of apple trees whose branches sagged with the weight of fruit, perfuming the air with a sweetness that drew villagers like bees to nectar. It was a place of laughter, harvest festivals, and quiet walks, where secrets seemed as unlikely as frost in July. Miss Jane Marple, an elderly spinster with a mind as sharp as her knitting needles, lived in a modest cottage overlooking the village green. Her days were filled with small pleasures, tending her roses, sipping tea by the fire, and observing the subtle undercurrents of human behavior that others overlooked. Her frail frame, wrapped in a woolen shawl, belied a relentless curiosity, honed over decades of watching St. Mary Mead's residents reveal themselves in unguarded moments. To Miss Marple, people were like her garden, orderly on the surface, but teeming with hidden roots and unexpected thorns. On a crisp September morning, as mist curled lazily over the orchard, the village's tranquility shattered. Miss Marple was pruning her dahlias when her maid Florence burst through the gate, her apron askew and her eyes wide with alarm. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful," she gasped, clutching her chest. Miss Marple murmured, setting her shears down. "How very deliberate. And in an orchard of all places." Her mind flickered to a case from her youth, a poisoning in Chipping Cleghorn, where the motive had been buried in a single careless remark. "Who found her exactly?" "The Carter twins, miss," Florence replied. "They ran screaming to Mr. Thorne. He owns the orchard, you know. He called the constable and now the whole village is in a tizzy." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she retrieved her knitting from the garden bench. "A tizzy," she said thoughtfully, "is often where the truth begins to slip out. I think I'll take a walk to the orchard, Florence. The air will do me good." By mid-morning, St. Mary Mead buzzed with gossip. Villagers clustered outside the post office, their voices a low hum of speculation. Miss Marple, her straw hat tilted against the sun, made her way along the lane to Maple Grove Orchard, her walking stick tapping a steady rhythm. The orchard's gate stood open, guarded by young Constable Reed, a well-meaning lad whose earnestness outstripped his experience. He tipped his helmet as Miss Marple approached. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his face flushed. "I'm afraid it's a grim business. Best not to linger, doctor's orders." "Nonsense, Constable," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "Fresh air is just the thing for an old woman's nerves. Might I have a peek? I knew Miss Hargrove, you see. Such a kind soul." Reed hesitated, then stepped aside. "Just don't touch anything, miss. It's not a sight for ladies." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I've seen more than you might think, young man." She stepped into the orchard, her gaze sweeping the scene. The air was thick with the scent of apples, and the ground crunched with fallen leaves. Old Bessie loomed ahead, its branches casting dappled shadows over the still form of Eleanor Hargrove. The teacher's gray hair was neatly pinned, her spectacles askew, and a chipped porcelain teacup lay overturned in the grass nearby, a detail that caught Miss Marple's attention. Her favorite cup, she murmured, a plot he coveted for expansion. Terrible thing, Thorne growled as Miss Marple approached, his pruning shears glinting in the sunlight. She was always poking her nose into my business. Wanted to turn my orchard into a playground for those brats of hers. Miss Marple tilted her head. Children do need space, Mr. Thorne. But Miss Hargrove had a way of inspiring them, didn't she? Thorne snorted. Inspiring or meddling, call it what you like. She's cost me enough trouble. Miss Marple's smile remained serene, but her mind catalogued his words. Trouble, she thought, often grows into motive. She continued her walk, pausing at the orchard's edge where Mrs. Lydia Finch, the village's self-appointed social arbiter, was holding court with a gaggle of women. Lydia, a plump woman in her 40s with a penchant for loud hats, had been Eleanor Hargrove's rival in the Women's Institute, particularly after Hargrove's apple pie dethroned Lydia's at the last harvest fair. "Oh, Miss Marple!" Lydia exclaimed, her voice pitched for drama. "It's simply awful. Eleanor was like a sister to me, though she could be dreadfully opinionated about recipes." "Sisters do have their differences," Miss Marple said mildly, noting the tremor in Lydia's hands. "You saw her yesterday, I presume, at the Institute meeting?" Lydia's eyes flickered. "Oh yes, briefly. She was her usual self, bossy but kind. I can't imagine who'd do such a thing." Miss Marple's needles clicked in her mind, though her hands were still. Crocodile tears, she thought, recalling a vicar's wife who wept too readily over a rival's misfortune. By noon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where Florence had prepared a pot of Earl Grey. Over tea, she learned more from the village grapevine. 2 other names surfaced. Dr. Simon Hale, the new physician, who had quarreled with Hargrove over his plans to expand the clinic onto orchard land, and Miss Beatrice Quill, Hargrove's assistant teacher, a quiet woman in her 30s who stood to inherit Hargrove's position and perhaps her modest savings. Dr. Hale knitting a scarf in soft blue wool. The village settled into an uneasy quiet, but her mind was far from still. The chipped teacup, the bitter scent, the orchard's shadows, they formed a puzzle, one she knew would unravel with patience. People, she said softly to herself, are never quite what they seem. Like apples, they may look perfect until you cut them open. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Apples. The morning sun had barely crested the hills of St. Mary Mead when the village awoke to the weight of its loss. The death of Miss Eleanor Hargrove, found poisoned beneath the ancient apple tree in Maple Grove orchard, had sent ripples of unease through the community. By noon, the cobblestone lanes hummed with speculation, and the air carried the faint tang of apples mingling with whispers of murder. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat perched neatly on her silver hair, stepped out from her cottage, her walking stick tapping a deliberate rhythm. She had no intention of letting gossip alone unravel the truth, for she knew that beneath the village's cozy veneer lay secrets as tangled as the orchard's roots. Miss Marple's destination was the heart of the village, the post office, where tongues wagged faster than knitting needles. As she approached, she saw clusters of villagers huddled outside, their voices low but urgent. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, was in her element, doling out stamps and theories with equal fervor. "It's a scandal, that's what it is," she declared to a group of women clutching their parcels. "Eleanor Hargrove, of all people, who'd want to harm a school teacher?" Miss Marple paused at the edge of the group, her eyes scanning faces. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," she said, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of curiosity. "A dreadful shock, isn't it? Have you heard any particulars?" Mrs. Price leaned over the counter, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's awful. They say it was poison, cyanide maybe, slipped into her tea. And that chipped teacup found beside her? She carried it everywhere like a talisman. Makes you wonder who she shared." Stood in orderly rows, their branches heavy with fruit. But the air held a tension that belied the pastoral calm. Near old Bessie, where Hargrove's body had been found, she spotted Mr. Thorne himself, his broad shoulders hunched as he pruned a wayward branch. His face, weathered by years outdoors, was set in a scowl, but his eyes flickered with unease as Miss Marple approached. "Good day, Mr. Thorne," she said. Her tone as warm as a summer afternoon. "Such a terrible business about Miss Hargrove. You must be shaken, with it happening on your land." Thorne set down his shears, wiping his hands on his corduroy trousers. "Terrible, he grunted. "She was always meddling, that woman. Wanted my orchard turned into a playground for her school. Said it was for the children. I've plans for this land. New trees, maybe a cider press. She was in the way." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes keen. "In the way," she repeated softly. "That must have been vexing. Did you see her yesterday morning by chance?" Thorne's jaw tightened. "Not me. I was mending fences on the far side. Ask anyone. But I'll tell you, Miss Marple, she had enemies. Not everyone loved her saintly act." "Enemies?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her mind was as sharp as the shears at Thorne's side. "That's a strong word for St. Mary Mead." Thorne shrugged, turning back to his tree. "People talk. You'd know better than most." Miss Marple smiled faintly, noting the defensiveness in his tone. She recalled a gardener from her youth, quick to anger but slow to act, whose bluster hid a softer heart. Thorne's limp, she observed, made stealth unlikely, but his words hinted at deeper currents. She bid him good day and continued her walk, her stick stirring the fallen leaves. At the orchard's edge, she encountered Mrs. Lydia Finch, the village's self-proclaimed queen of social affairs. Lydia No, at my cottage," Lydia said quickly, then faltered. "Well, briefly. She was in a rush, always so busy with those children." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. Tea at Lydia's cottage, yet the chipped teacup was found in the orchard. She recalled a vicar's wife in Chipping Cleghorn, whose tears over a rival masked a sharper intent. "You must miss her dreadfully," she said, her tone sympathetic but her eyes watchful. As Lydia prattled on about the Institute's plans for a memorial, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the other suspects whispered about in the village. Dr. Simon Hale, the new physician, had clashed with Hargrove over his ambitious plan to expand the clinic onto orchard land. His charm, Florence had noted, masked a ruthless streak. Then there was Miss Beatrice Quill, Hargrove's assistant teacher, a mousy woman whose quiet demeanor hid a hunger for advancement. And Colonel Arthur Blackwood, whose nephew's expulsion had left him bristling with indignation. Miss Marple made her way to the village tea shop, where the air was thick with scones and speculation. Seated at a corner table, she overheard snippets of conversation. "That Dr. Hale," muttered old Mr. Gibbs, stirring his tea. "He was near the orchard yesterday. I saw him. Said he was checking on a patient, but who's poorly out there." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked if she'd been knitting, but her hands rested in her lap, her mind weaving patterns. She rose and approached the counter, where young Sally, the tea-shop girl, was wiping cups. "Good day, Sally," she said. "I hear Dr. Hale was about yesterday. A busy man, isn't he?" Sally blushed, her hands fumbling. "Oh yes, Miss Marple. He's ever so kind, but he was cross with Miss Hargrove. Said her protests would ruin his clinic. I saw him by the orchard gate, looking all flustered." "Flustered," Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft. "How interesting. And Miss Quill? She must be devastated, losing her mentor." Sally hesitated. "She's quiet, miss, but, well, she's been acting on." "Colonel. It can lead to all sorts of actions." As she returned to her cottage, the village settling into dusk, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tapestry of clues and characters. Thorne's grudge, Lydia's jealousy, Hale's ambition, Quill's quiet envy, Blackwood's wounded pride. Each a thread in the puzzle. The chipped teacup loomed largest, a detail too personal to ignore. "People share tea with those they trust," she murmured, settling by her fire. "Or those they wish to deceive." Chapter 3. Tea and Suspicions. The autumn light filtered through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead's vicarage, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak table where Miss Jane Marple sat, a cup of Earl Grey steaming gently before her. It was the afternoon of the day following Miss Eleanor Hargrove's tragic death in Maple Grove Orchard, and the village was still abuzz with shock and conjecture. Miss Marple, invited for tea by the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clements, saw the occasion as more than a social call. Tea, she knew, loosened tongues, and the vicarage was a crucible for village secrets. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind a mild smile, were ready to catch every fleeting glance and unguarded word. Mrs. Clements, a kindly woman with a penchant for floral dresses, poured tea with practiced grace. "Such a dreadful thing, Miss Marple," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Eleanor was a pillar of our community. To think someone poisoned her, here in St. Mary Mead. It's unimaginable." "Quite unimaginable," Miss Marple agreed, stirring her tea with a delicate clink. "Yet it has happened, and we must face it. Tell me, Mrs. Clements, did you see Miss Hargrove yesterday?" She was so active in village affairs. Mrs. Clements hesitated, her teaspoon pausing mid-air. "Well, yes, briefly. She stopped by the vicarage to discuss the harvest festival. She seemed preoccupied, I thought. Kept checking her watch, as if she had an appointment." "An appointment," Miss Marple murmured, her mind noting the detail. "Perhaps in the orchard." "Quill and Colonel Arthur Blackwood." The vicar, Reverend Clements, joined them, his face etched with concern. "The constable's been asking questions," he said, settling into a chair. "He's got his eye on Thorne, you know. Says there's a bottle of rat poison missing from his shed. But I can't believe Reginald would do such a thing." "Nor I," Miss Marple said, though her tone held a note of caution. "Poison requires a certain calculation, and Mr. Thorne strikes me as impulsive. Still, missing poison is worth noting." "Did anyone else see Miss Hargrove yesterday?" Reverend Clements rubbed his chin. "Dr. Hale was about, I heard. He's been pushing for that clinic expansion, and Eleanor was dead set against it. Said it would spoil the orchard's peace. They had words at the last parish meeting. Miss Marple nodded, her mind conjuring the image of Dr. Hale, a young man whose charm masked an ambitious streak. Words can fester, she said. And what of Miss Quill? She worked closely with Miss Hargrove, didn't she? Mrs. Clements leaned forward, her voice dropping. Oh, Beatrice Quill is a quiet one, but devoted. Though, I did hear she was seen at the schoolhouse late yesterday, sorting papers. Some say she wanted Eleanor's position. And there's talk of money. Eleanor had a small inheritance, you know, and Beatrice might benefit. Miss Marple's fingers itched for her knitting, a habit that steadied her thoughts, but she clasped her hands instead. Money and ambition, she mused. Such common seeds, yet they grow the most tangled vines. As the tea dwindled, Miss Marple excused herself, promising to return for the harvest festival planning. Her next stop was the village square, where the daily rhythm of St. Mary Mead continued despite the shadow of murder. She spotted Dr. Simon Hale emerging from his clinic, his dark hair neatly combed, his smile as polished as his stethoscope. He was a newcomer, barely a year in the village, and his plans for a modern clinic had stirred both admiration and resentment. "Good afternoon, Dr. Hale," Miss Marple said, approaching with her usual air of harmony. "Farewell," noting the faint flush on his cheeks. A charming man, she thought, but charm could hide as much as it revealed. She recalled a doctor in her youth whose smooth words masked a debt-ridden heart. Her next encounter was unplanned. As she passed the schoolhouse, its red brick facade glowing in the afternoon light, she saw Miss Beatrice Quill locking the door. Beatrice, a slight woman in her 30s with mousy hair and nervous eyes, clutched a stack of books to her chest. Her plain dress and trembling hands gave her the air of a startled doe. "Miss Quill," Miss Marple called gently, approaching. "How you must be grieving. Miss Hargrove was so fond of you." Beatrice's eyes darted to the ground. "She was strict, but fair," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I admired her greatly. I can't believe she's gone." Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind was alert. It must be hard, taking on her duties now. "You were at the schoolhouse late yesterday, I hear." Beatrice's hands tightened on the books. "Just tidying up. Eleanor left papers everywhere. I wanted to help." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "You shared tea with her often, didn't you? That chipped cup of hers was so distinctive." Beatrice's face paled. "Sometimes," she mumbled. She liked her tea strong. She excused herself abruptly, hurrying down the lane. Miss Marple watched her go, her thoughts circling. Beatrice's nervousness was palpable, like a thread pulled too tight. She recalled a housemaid from years ago, quiet and loyal, whose envy had simmered until it spilled over. The chipped teacup, she thought, was a key, too personal for a casual encounter. Her final stop was the village pub, where Colonel Arthur Blackwood held court at a corner table, his military mustache bristling as he recounted war stories to a dwindling audience. His nephew's expulsion by Hargrove had been a public slight, and his pride was as polished as his medals. "Miss Marple," Beatrice's trembling hands, Blackwood's wounded pride, each a piece of the puzzle. The teacup, with its bitter trace of cyanide, loomed largest. "Tea is a ritual," she murmured, "and rituals reveal trust or betrayal." Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled with her knitting, the soft click of needles mirroring her thoughts. The village was a garden, she thought. its secrets hidden beneath tidy rows. But gardens could be dug up, and Miss Marple was an expert gardener. Chapter 4. The False Scent. The golden haze of late September settled over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of its thatched roofs and cobblestone lanes. 3 days had passed since Miss Eleanor Hargrove's body was found beneath old Bessie in Maple Grove Orchard, her life snuffed out by a subtle poison slipped into her tea. The village, though outwardly resuming its gentle rhythm, thrummed with unease. Whispers of murder followed villagers to the butcher, the baker, and the church pews, each conversation laced with theories and suspicions. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her cottage hearth, her knitting needles clicking in a steady cadence, sifted through these whispers like a gardener turning soil. She knew the truth often hid in the overlooked, the mundane details others dismissed. This morning Miss Marple donned her tweed coat and straw hat, her walking stick a familiar companion as she set out for the village square. Her encounters with suspects, Reginald Thorne, Lydia Finch, Dr. Simon Hale, Beatrice Quill, and Colonel Arthur Blackwood, had painted a vivid tapestry of motives, but she needed more than threads. The chipped teacup found beside Hargrove's body, its rim stained with the bitter scent of cyanide, lingered in her mind. Who had shared that fatal cup? The answer, she suspected, lay not in grand gestures but in the quiet corners of St. Mary Mead's daily life. Her first stop was the village hall, where Constable Reed was addressing a small crowd of concerned citizens. The young officer, his helmet slightly askew, held up a small glass bottle, its label faded but legible. "We found this in Mr. Gold. Even small things matter in a murder," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. She recalled a case in her youth where a stolen key had seemed trivial until it unlocked a killer's motive. The crowd dispersed, but Miss Marple lingered, noting the constable's focus on Thorne. Too obvious, she thought, like a red herring dangling in a fishmonger's window. Her next destination was the orchard itself, where the air was thick with the scent of ripened fruit and fallen leaves. The scene of Hargrove's death was cordoned off with twine, though curious villagers still peered from a distance. Miss Marple approached old Bessie, her eyes scanning the ground. The chipped teacup had been taken for evidence, but she pictured it clearly. Overturned in the grass, its handle worn from years of use. She crouched, her joints protesting, and noticed a faint indentation in the soil, small, like a woman's shoe, leading toward the orchard's edge. "Interesting," she murmured, straightening. "Someone left in a hurry." As she walked the orchard's perimeter, she spotted Lydia Finch, her floral hat bobbing as she chatted with a neighbor near the gate. Lydia's rivalry with Hargrove over the apple pie contest was the talk of the village, and her claim of a sisterly tea with the victim rang hollow to Miss Marple's ears. Approaching, she offered a warm smile. "Mrs. Finch, how kind of you to be out comforting others in such a trying time." Lydia's eyes widened, her hands fluttering to her hat. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's my duty, isn't it? Poor Eleanor. We were so close. I've been telling everyone she'd never have enemies. Not really." "Not even over a pie recipe?" Miss Marple asked, her tone innocent. "I hear your rivalry was quite spirited." Lydia laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, that was just friendly competition. I'd never hold a grudge. Why, we laughed about it over tea at my cottage the other day." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the repetition of the tea story. "How lovely," she said. "And did you use her favorite teacup, the chipped one, smooth but strained?" "Miss Marple, a sad time indeed. I'm doing my best to keep the village calm." Eleanor's death is a blow to us all. Of course, Miss Marple said, her eyes resting on his fidgeting hands. You prescribed her a tonic, I believe, for her nerves? Yes, a mild sedative, Hale replied, his tone careful. She was under strain, village politics, you know. But I assure you it was harmless. And your visit to the orchard yesterday? Miss Marple pressed gently. Checking on Mrs. Carter, I hear? Hale's jaw tightened. Yes, exactly. Routine visit. I was nowhere near old Bessie. He glanced at his watch, excusing himself with a curt nod. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts circling. His alibi was plausible, but his unease was palpable. She recalled a chemist from her past whose perfect manners hid a gambling debt. Hale's ambition, she suspected, might stretch beyond a clinic. Her final stop was the schoolhouse, where Miss Beatrice Quill was sorting through Hargrove's desk, her hands trembling as she stacked papers. Beatrice's quiet demeanor and sudden promotion to head teacher made her a figure of interest, and village gossip hinted at envy or financial strain. Miss Quill, Miss Marple said, stepping inside. You're doing admirable work, carrying on Miss Hargrove's duties. Beatrice started, dropping a pencil. Oh, Miss Marple, I'm just trying to keep things orderly. Eleanor would have wanted it. Naturally, Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the desk. A ledger caught her attention, its pages marked with small sums, loans perhaps to villagers. You were close to her, weren't you? Shared tea often, I imagine, with that chipped cup of hers. Beatrice's face paled. Sometimes, she whispered. She liked it strong, with a splash of milk. Her hands clenched and she turned away, busying herself with papers. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was sharp. Beatrice's Chapter 5. Shadows in the Schoolroom. The autumn days in St. Mary Mead grew shorter, the late September light casting long shadows across the village's cobblestone lanes and thatched roofs. 4 days had passed since Miss Eleanor Hargrove's lifeless form was discovered beneath Old Bessie and Maple Grove Orchard, her death by poison sending a chill through the community's heart. The village, though outwardly bustling with preparations for the upcoming harvest festival, simmered with suspicion. Miss Jane Marple, her frail figure wrapped in a woolen shawl, sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she pieced together the puzzle of Hargrove's murder. The chipped teacup, the faint scent of cyanide, the small footprint in the orchard mud. These were the threads she wove, each a clue to a truth hidden in plain sight. Miss Marple's morning began with a decision to visit the schoolhouse, where Hargrove had spent her days shaping young minds. The red brick building, with its ivy-clad walls and leaded windows, stood at the edge of the village, a stone's throw from the orchard. She had volunteered to help sort Hargrove's belongings, a task that allowed her to observe without arousing suspicion. People reveal themselves in their possessions, she murmured to her maid, Florence, as she donned her straw hat. A desk can tell as many stories as a diary. The schoolhouse was quiet when Miss Marple arrived, the children dismissed early for the festival preparations. Miss Beatrice Quill, Hargrove's assistant and now interim head teacher, was already there, her mousy figure bent over a cluttered desk. Papers and books were stacked haphazardly, and Beatrice's hands trembled as she sorted them, her eyes darting nervously when she noticed Miss Marple. "Good morning, Miss Quill," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a summer breeze. You're doing such a brave job, stepping into Miss Hargrove's shoes. It must be quite overwhelming. Beatrice managed a faint smile, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. I'm trying, Miss Marple. Eleanor left everything in such a state. I just want to honor her memory. A month ago. Goodness, Miss Marple murmured. Dr. Hale owed her quite a sum. For his clinic, I presume. Beatrice's face paled. I suppose so. Eleanor was kind, but she expected repayment. She was strict about it. Strictness can breed resentment, Miss Marple said softly, closing the ledger. She recalled a grocer's wife from years ago whose loans to neighbors had sparked quiet grudges. Did you ever borrow from her, Miss Quill? Beatrice's hands clenched, her voice barely a whisper. Once, a small amount. I paid it back. She was generous to a fault. She turned away, busying herself with a stack of books. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was sharp. Beatrice's nervousness was a thread pulled too tight, and the ledger suggested more than village charity. She moved to a shelf, pretending to organize, but her eyes caught a small detail. A child's drawing, tucked among Hargrove's papers, depicting two figures sharing tea under a tree. One figure wore a familiar mousy dress. Charming, Miss Marple said, holding it up. One of your pupils, Miss Quill? Beatrice glanced at it, her eyes widening. Oh, that's just little Mary's sketch. She loved Eleanor. Miss Marple nodded, tucking the drawing back. The image lingered in her mind, a clue, perhaps, or a child's innocent observation. She bid Beatrice good day and stepped outside, the crisp air sharpening her thoughts. Her next stop was the village tea shop, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. Seated at a corner table, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price, the postmistress, regaling a customer with the latest theory. They're saying it's the Colonel now, she whispered loudly. His walking stick was found near the orchard, you know. Blackwood's got a temper, and that nephew of his was in trouble with Hargrove. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her ears attuned. Colonel Arthur Blackwood's pride had been wounded by Hargrove's expulsion of his nephew Tommy, but a walking stick seemed too convenient a clue. She recalled a case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a misplaced glove had been planted to mislead. Approaching the counter, she smiled at Mrs. Price. Good day, Mrs. Price, slightly. Miss Marple. A grim time for St. Mary Mead. Care for a sherry? Thank you, no, Miss Marple said, settling opposite him. I hear your walking stick caused some excitement. Stolen, you say? Blackwood's jaw tightened. Aye, from this very pub. Left it by the bar Wednesday night. Found it missing when I came back for it. Next thing I know, Reed's waving it about like evidence. Ridiculous. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Most curious. And you were here all morning when Miss Hargrove was found? With Gibbs and old Tompkins playing cards, Blackwood said firmly. Ask them. I've no love for Hargrove after what she did to Tommy, but I'm no poisoner. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Pride stings, but it rarely kills. She bid him farewell, her thought circling. Blackwood's alibi was solid, and the stick felt like another false scent, too neatly placed to be true. As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the orchard, where Mr. Reginald Thorne was repairing a fence. His limp slowed his movements, but his scowl was as fierce as ever. Still poking about, Miss Marple? He called, his tone gruff. Constable's got it wrong about that poison. I keep my shed locked tight. Locked sheds can be opened, Miss Marple said mildly. But I'm sure you're right. It's the teacup that puzzles me, Mr. Thorne. Did you ever share tea with Miss Hargrove? Thorne snorted. Tea? Not my sort of thing. She brought that chipped cup everywhere like a blasted heirloom. He turned back to his fence, dismissing her. Miss Marple's mind hummed. Thorne's bluntness suggested innocence, but his knowledge of the teacup was telling. She recalled a farmer from her youth, whose gruff exterior hid a meticulous mind. The poison, she thought, required such precision. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled with her knitting, the soft click of needles mirroring her thoughts. The ledger's revelation about Hale's debt was significant. Orchard. A pall of unease hung over the festivities. The chipped teacup, the bitter trace of cyanide, the small footprint in the mud. These clues swirled in Miss Jane Marple's mind as she sat by her cottage hearth, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. The village was a garden of secrets, and she was determined to unearth them, one careful dig at a time. Miss Marple rose early, her straw hat and tweed coat a familiar sight, as she stepped into the crisp morning air. The festival preparations were in full swing, with villagers stringing bunting across the square and setting up stalls for apple tarts and cider. She knew the event would draw the suspects: Reginald Thorne, Lydia Finch, Dr. Simon Hale, Beatrice Quill, and Colonel Arthur Blackwood, into one place, their interactions ripe for observation. Festivals, she murmured to her maid Florence, bring out both the best and the worst in people, like a mirror held to the heart. Her first stop was the village green, where the festival's main tent buzzed with activity. Lydia Finch, her floral hat more extravagant than ever, was directing the Women's Institute in arranging a display of preserves. Her rivalry with Hargrove over the apple pie contest still lingered in village gossip, and her claim of a sisterly tea with the victim felt increasingly suspect. Miss Marple approached, her smile as warm as the autumn sun. "Good morning, Mrs. Finch," she said, eyeing the jars of jam. "Your preserves look splendid." Miss Hargrove would have been proud to see the Institute carrying on. Lydia's hands fluttered to her hat, her smile tight. "Oh, Miss Marple, we're doing our best. Eleanor loved the festival, you know. It's only right we honor her." Her voice trembled, but her eyes darted toward a group of women whispering nearby. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "You shared tea with her just before, didn't you? At your cottage, I believe?" Lydia's smile faltered. Thorne grunted, setting down a crate. She appreciated it enough to want it for her school. Always meddling, that one. "But I didn't poison her, if that's what you're thinking. My shed's poison was stolen, and I was mending fences that morning." "So you said," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Did you ever see her with that chipped teacup? She was fond of it, wasn't she?" Thorne's scowl softened slightly. "Aye, always clutching it like a treasure. Saw her with it at the schoolhouse once, sharing tea with that Quill girl." He shrugged and turned back to his crates. Miss Marple's mind hummed. Thorne's mention of Beatrice Quill and the teacup was a new thread, tying the assistant teacher to Hargrove's final moments. She recalled a farmer from her youth whose bluntness hid no guile, but Thorne's knowledge suggested he saw more than he let on. As she wandered the festival, Miss Marple noticed Dr. Simon Hale near the first aid tent, his charming smile reassuring a group of children. His clash with Hargrove over the clinic expansion, coupled with the £50 debt in her ledger, made him a figure of interest. She approached, her air of harmlessness disarming. Dr. Hale, how kind of you to volunteer. Miss Hargrove would have admired your community spirit. Hale's smile was polished, but his eyes flickered. She was a fine woman, Miss Marple, if a bit stubborn. Her protests about my clinic were misguided, but I held no grudge. Of course, Miss Marple said, her eyes resting on his hands which toyed with a stethoscope. You prescribed her a tonic, I hear, and you were near the orchard that morning? Visiting Mrs. Carter, Hale said quickly. A routine call. I was nowhere near old Bessie. He excused himself, his steps brisk. Miss Marple's thoughts circled. Hale's alibi was consistent, but his debt to Hargrove suggested a pressure point. She recalled a solicitor from her past whose debts had driven him to desperation. The ledger, she thought, might hold the key to his motives. Her attention shifted to Beatrice Quill, who stood at a stall to the teacup was telling, echoing Thorne's observation. She recalled a housemaid, quiet and loyal, whose envy had simmered into betrayal. The drawing, she thought, might be more than a child's fancy. A new clue surfaced as Miss Marple passed a stall selling old books. Tucked among them was a small diary, its cover embossed with Hargrove's initials. She purchased it discreetly, slipping it into her bag. Back at her cottage, she examined it by lamplight, her fingers tracing the pages. An entry from the day before Hargrove's death read, "Betrayed by one I trusted. Must confront them tomorrow." The ink was fresh, the writing hurried. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A confrontation, she murmured. But was this diary left to be found? She recalled the small footprint in the orchard mud, feminine and precise, leading toward Beatrice's cottage. The constable had dismissed it, focusing on Thorne's poison. But Miss Marple suspected a plant, like the Colonel's walking stick. She thought of a case in her youth, where a forged letter had misled the police. A clever deception, she said softly. But deceptions leave traces. At the festival's evening dance, Miss Marple observed the suspects mingle. Thorne argued with Hale over land rights, their voices sharp but controlled. Lydia whispered to Beatrice about secrets best buried, her eyes darting to Miss Marple. Blackwood, nursing a pint, watched from a corner, his pride still smarting. The village was a stage, and each player wore a mask. As she walked home, the stars bright above Miss Marple's thoughts wove a pattern. The diary's fresh ink suggested a plant, designed to mislead. Lydia's tea story was unraveling, and Hale's debt loomed large. Beatrice's nervousness and Thorne's observation tied her to the teacup, while Blackwood's stick felt like another false lead. The footprint, though, was a quiet clue, its direction a whisper of intent. Settling by her fire, Miss Marple picked up her knitting, the needle's click a counterpoint to her thoughts. The festival hides as much as it cryptic note. Each was a leaf turning in the autumn of her investigation, revealing patterns beneath the surface. Miss Marple's morning began with a visit to the village chemist, Mr. Grayson, whose shop was a treasure trove of bottles and powders. The constable's focus on Reginald Thorne's missing rat poison had stirred her curiosity, but she suspected the poison was a distraction. Cyanide, the doctor had suggested, was the likely culprit, and its source might lie in subtler hands. She entered the shop, the bell jingling softly, and found Mr. Grayson behind the counter, polishing his spectacles. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Miss Marple said, her voice as warm as a fireside. "Such a sad time for St. Mary Mead. I wonder if you might help with a small matter." Cyanide, I hear, was used in poor Miss Hargrove's death. Is it common in a village like ours? Grayson's hands paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Cyanide. Not common, Miss Marple, but not impossible. It's used in small quantities for pest control, sometimes in orchards. Apple seeds, you know, contain traces of it. Amygdalin. Breaks down to cyanide if processed right. But it takes knowledge to extract it. Knowledge, Miss Marple echoed, her eyes twinkling. A gardener might know, perhaps. Or a doctor. Grayson hesitated. Aye, a doctor like Hale would know. Or someone like Mrs. Finch with her gardening club. She's always experimenting with plants. Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the detail. Lydia Finch's gardening prowess and Dr. Simon Hale's medical expertise made them prime candidates for crafting such a poison. She recalled a case from her youth where a chemist's assistant had used plant knowledge to deadly ends. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson," she said. "You've been most helpful." Her next stop was the orchard, where the air was thick with the scent of apples and damp earth. The festival had left the ground littered with trampled leaves, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the path. Interest. Miss Marple approached, her air of harmlessness disarming. "Dr. Hale, how kind of you to be out and about. Checking on orchard workers, perhaps?" Hale's smile was tight, his eyes scanning the trees. "Just a walk, Miss Marple. Clears the head. This business with Eleanor is unsettling." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes resting on his bag. "You prescribed her a tonic, I recall. Did you ever supply her with anything stronger? For her nerves, perhaps?" Hale's jaw tightened. "Just a sedative. Perfectly safe. I'm no poisoner, if that's what you're implying." He shifted his bag and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a faint clink of glass inside. "Of course not," she said, her tone soothing. "But you were near the orchard that morning, weren't you? Visiting Mrs. Carter?" "Yes, as I've said," Hale replied, his voice sharp. "Routine call. Now if you'll excuse me." He hurried off, his steps brisk. Miss Marple's mind hummed. The clink of glass, the debt, the orchard visit. Hale's polished exterior was cracking. She recalled a solicitor from her past whose debts had driven him to desperate acts. The vial, she thought, might tie to him, but she needed more. Her next encounter was with Lydia Finch, whom she found in her garden, pruning roses with a vigor that belied her theatrical grief. Lydia's rivalry with Hargrove and her questionable tea story made her a suspect worth watching. "Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple called, approaching the gate. "Your roses are thriving. You must have a knack for chemistry with all your gardening." Lydia's shears paused, her eyes flickering. "Oh, Miss Marple, just a hobby. Eleanor always admired my flowers, you know. We shared such lovely teas." Her voice trembled, but her hands were steady. "Lovely indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes on the rose bushes. "You know plants well. Apple seeds, for instance. Could they be dangerous?" Lydia laughed, a brittle sound. "Seeds? Oh, they're harmless unless—" "Be proud of your dedication." Beatrice started, dropping a chalk stick. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm just keeping things in order. It's what she'd want." "Naturally," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the desk. A small key half hidden under a book caught her attention. "Is this yours?" she asked, holding it up. Beatrice's face paled. It's for the supply cupboard. Eleanor gave it to me. Her hands trembled as she took it. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was sharp. The key suggested access, perhaps to more than supplies. She recalled a shop girl whose quiet demeanor hid a theft. You shared tea with her often, didn't you? In that chipped cup. Beatrice's voice was barely audible. Sometimes. She liked it strong. She turned away, her hands clutching the desk. Miss Marple bid her good day and stepped outside, the evening air cool against her cheeks. The vial, the diary, the key. Each clue was a leaf turning, revealing new angles. She visited the constable, showing him the vial, which he confirmed matched those used for cyanide in pest control. Could be anyone's, Reed said, scratching his head. But Hale's a doctor, and Mrs. Finch knows plants. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple lit a fire and settled with her knitting, the needle's click a counterpoint to her thoughts. The vial pointed to Hale or Lydia, but Beatrice's key and nervousness suggested deeper involvement. Thorne's poison and Blackwood's stick were fading as leads, too obvious to trust. The diary's fresh ink and the footprint's direction still nagged at her, hinting at a staged deception. The leaves are turning, she murmured, and with them the truth. The village was a garden, its secrets ripening, but Miss Marple's patience was a steady hand, ready to pluck them bare. Chapter 8. Narrowing the Net. The village of St. Mary Mead, bathed in the soft amber light of early October, carried on with its daily rhythms. But the shadow of Miss Eleanor Hargrove's murder lingered like a stubborn mist. 7 days had passed since the school poison and Blackwood's walking stick had proven too obvious. False scents designed to mislead. The real truth, she suspected, lay in the subtler clues. The teacup's intimacy, the diary's fresh ink, and the footprint leading toward Beatrice's cottage. Her first task was to revisit the orchard, where the air was crisp with the scent of apples and damp leaves. The scene of Hargrove's death was quieter now, the twine cordons sagging, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the ground near old Bessie. The tiny vial she'd found yesterday, wrapped in her handkerchief, had been confirmed by the constable as a possible cyanide container, but its origin was unclear. She crouched, her joints creaking, and noticed a faint scratch in the bark of old Bessie. A deliberate mark, perhaps, like a signpost for a hidden act. "Curious," she murmured, tracing it with her finger. It was too precise for a random scratch, suggesting someone had lingered here with purpose. As she stood, she spotted Dr. Simon Hale crossing the orchard, his medical bag slung over his shoulder. His 50-pound debt to Hargrove noted in her ledger, and his presence near the orchard on the fatal morning made him a key figure. Miss Marple approached, her smile disarming. "Dr. Hale, you're out early. Checking on the orchard workers, perhaps?" Hale's charm faltered, his eyes flickering to the tree. "Just a walk, Miss Marple. The air's good for thinking. This business with Eleanor is troubling." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes on his bag. "That vial found here. Could it be from your clinic? You handle such things, don't you?" Hale's jaw tightened. "Vials are common enough. I've no use for cyanide. I told you I was with Mrs. Carter that morning." His voice was sharp and he hurried off, his steps uneven. Miss Marple's mind hummed. Hale's defensiveness and the clink of glass in his bag yesterday suggested access to the poison. She recalled a chemist from her youth whose nervous denials had betrayed a thing. She laughed a brittle sound and turned back to her plants. Miss Marple's thoughts circled. Lydia's repeated denial of the teacup was a thread fraying under scrutiny. She recalled a neighbor whose gardening prowess had hidden a darker knowledge. The scratch on old Bessie, she thought, might tie to someone with access to the orchard. Someone like Lydia. Her final visit was to the schoolhouse where Beatrice Quill was grading papers, her mousy figure hunched over a desk. The ledger, the child's drawing, and the small key had made Beatrice a focal point, and the footprint toward her cottage was a nagging clue. Miss Marple entered quietly, her smile warm. "Miss Quill, you're working so diligently. Miss Hargrove would be proud." Beatrice started, dropping her pen. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm just keeping up with lessons. It's what she'd want." "Naturally," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the room. The key she'd seen yesterday was gone, but a small locked box sat on a shelf, its lid slightly ajar. "That box," she said, pointing. "Is it for school supplies?" Beatrice's face paled. "Yes, just old records." Eleanor kept it locked. She fumbled with her papers, avoiding Miss Marple's gaze. Miss Marple's smile was gentle, but her mind was sharp. The box, she suspected, held more than records. She recalled a shopgirl whose quiet demeanor hid a secret stash. "You shared tea with her often, didn't you? In that chipped cup?" Beatrice's hands trembled. "Sometimes," she whispered. "She liked it strong." She excused herself, hurrying to the back room. Miss Marple approached the box, lifting the lid to reveal a bundle of letters tied with string. One, partially torn, bore Hargrove's handwriting. "Beatrice, you must stop. I know what you've done." The words were stark, a confrontation cut short. Miss Marple slipped the letter back, her thoughts racing. The footprint, the key, the letter. Beatrice was entangled deeper than she'd admitted. As she left the vial pointed to Hale's access to chemicals, but his alibi held, if shakily. Lydia's plant knowledge and evasive tea story suggested guile, but no direct link to the murder site. Beatrice's letter, key, and footprint were damning, yet her nervousness could stem from fear rather than guilt. The diary's fresh ink and the scratch on old Bessie hinted at a staged scene. But by whom? She visited the constable, sharing the letter's contents. Reed scratched his head. "Beatrice, eh? That letter's trouble. But Hale's vial and Mrs. Finch's plants are just as likely." Miss Marple's needles would have clicked if she'd been knitting, but her hands rested in her lap. "The truth is like a net," she murmured, tightening with each tug. She recalled a case where a planted clue had misled the police, but a single letter had cracked the case. Beatrice's letter was a cornerstone, but the teacup remained the heart of the puzzle. As evening fell, Miss Marple settled by her fire, her thoughts weaving a pattern. The net was closing, but one final tug was needed. "The orchard hides its secrets," she said softly. "But not for long." The village was a garden, its truths ripening, and Miss Marple's patience was a steady hand, ready to harvest them. Chapter 9. The Revelation in the Parlor. The village of St. Mary Mead, cloaked in the soft twilight of early October, seemed to hold its breath. 8 days had passed since Miss Eleanor Hargrove was found poisoned beneath old Bessie in Maple Grove Orchard, her chipped teacup a silent testament to a calculated betrayal. The village's cozy facade belied the tension simmering beneath, as whispers of cyanide and motive swirled through its lanes. Miss Jane Marple, her frail figure wrapped in a woolen shawl, had spent the week weaving a net of clues: the teacup, the small footprint, the vial, the diary, the letter, the key, each tightening around the truth. Tonight, in the vicarage parlor, she would draw that net closed, revealing the murderer among them. Miss Marple had requested a gathering at the gentle as a summer breeze. Miss Hargrove's death has shaken us all, but the truth, like a garden, requires careful tending. Tonight, I believe we can uncover it. The room stirred, eyes darting, Thorne's scowl deepening, Lydia's hands clutching her teacup. Hale smiled tight. Beatrice's face pale, Blackwood's mustache bristling. Miss Marple's gaze was serene, but her mind was a steel trap. "Let us begin with the facts," she said, pacing slowly. Eleanor Hargrove was poisoned with cyanide, slipped into her tea, drunk from her cherished chipped teacup beneath old Bessie. No struggle, no violence. A quiet, intimate act. The question is, who shared that fatal cup? She turned to Thorne, his broad shoulders hunched. "Mr. Thorne, you were the obvious suspect. Your missing rat poison and your feud with Eleanor over the schoolhouse land pointed to you. But your limp makes stealth unlikely, and the poison was stolen, wasn't it?" Thorne grunted, his face red. "Told you, it was gone weeks before. I'm no murderer." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "The poison was a false scent. Too crude for this crime." She recalled a case where a stolen tool had misled the police and dismissed Thorne with a nod. She turned to Colonel Blackwood, his military bearing rigid. "Colonel, your walking stick found near the orchard seemed damning. But you were at the pub with witnesses, and the stick was stolen, wasn't it?" Blackwood nodded, his voice gruff. "Planted, I'd wager. I've no stomach for poison." Miss Marple's smile was gentle. "Pride stings, but your alibi holds." She dismissed him, her net tightening. The room grew quieter, the fires crackled loud in the silence. Miss Marple faced Lydia Finch, whose floral hat seemed to wilt under scrutiny. "Mrs. Finch, your rivalry with Eleanor over the apple pie contest was well known. You claimed a sisterly tea at your cottage, but you insisted on fine china, never her chipped teacup. Yet you know plants, don't, and your alibi wavers. A nurse saw you near the orchard gate, not Mrs. Carter's cottage." She recalled a solicitor whose debts had driven him to desperation, but Hale's role felt incomplete. Finally, she faced Beatrice Quill, whose mousy figure seemed to shrink into her chair. "Miss Quill, you were Eleanor's shadow, her trusted assistant. You shared tea with her often in that chipped cup. A child's drawing showed you together under a tree. A footprint led to your cottage, and a letter in Eleanor's hand accused you of something grave." Beatrice's face crumpled, her voice a whisper. I didn't mean any harm." Miss Marple's voice softened, but her eyes were steel. "The murderer is among us, and it is you, Miss Quill. Eleanor discovered you forging school funds to pay gambling debts, a secret you couldn't bear exposed. You learned from her own lessons about apple seeds, grinding them to extract cyanide. You invited her to the orchard for tea, using her beloved cup, and slipped the poison in. The footprint was yours, the diary a plant to mislead, the letter your undoing." Beatrice sobbed, her hands covering her face. "She was going to tell everyone. I'd lose everything, my job, my home. I just wanted to stop her. The room gasped, Lydia dropping her teacup, Hale's jaw tightening, Thorne's scowl softening, Blackwood's eyes wide. Constable Reed, standing by the door, stepped forward, his face grim. Miss Quill, you'll come with me. Beatrice rose, trembling, as Reed gently led her out. The parlor fell silent, the fire's glow casting shadows on stunned faces. Mrs. Clements clutched her husband's arm, tears in her eyes. How awful, she whispered. Poor Eleanor. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her frail frame weary but her mind clear. The truth is often painful, she said softly, but it brings peace. Eleanor trusted Beatrice, and that trust was her downfall. The teacup told the story. It was too personal for a stranger's hand. All the same. The village was a garden, its secrets uprooted, and Miss Marple's quiet patience had harvested the truth. Chapter 10. Tea and Tranquility. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its golden rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage. 9 days had passed since Miss Eleanor Hargrove's lifeless body was found beneath Old Bessie in Maple Grove Orchard, her death by cyanide a wound in the village's heart. The dramatic revelation in the vicarage parlor the previous evening, where Miss Marple had unmasked Beatrice Quill as the murderer, had restored a fragile peace to the community. Now, over a pot of Earl Grey, Miss Marple prepared to explain the intricate threads of the mystery to her friends, her knitting needles clicking softly as she settled into her favorite armchair by the fire. The vicarage had sent a note inviting Miss Marple for morning tea, a gathering to reflect on the resolution of the case. Reverend and Mrs. Clements, along with a few trusted villagers, awaited her in the cozy parlor, where the scent of scones and the clink of china created an atmosphere of quiet comfort. Miss Marple, her straw hat exchanged for a soft shawl, arrived with her usual air of unassuming wisdom, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. The village, she knew, needed closure as much as justice, and her explanation would be a balm to its unease. Mrs. Clements greeted her warmly, pouring tea into delicate cups. Miss Marple, we're so grateful, she said, her voice trembling with relief. To think it was Beatrice, poor soul. How did you unravel it all? Miss Marple smiled, accepting a cup. The truth, my dear, is like a garden. It requires patience to see what lies beneath the surface. Let me tell you how it came together. She sipped her tea, her thoughts as orderly as her knitting, and began. Eleanor Hargrove's death was a quiet act, intimate and deliberate, she said, her voice soft but clear. The chipped teacup found beside her was the stick seemed so damning. A false scent, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. The stick was stolen from the pub, planted to mislead. The colonel's pride was stung by his nephew's expulsion, but his alibi, playing cards with Mr. Gibbs and Tompkins, was solid. Pride, I found, rarely turns to poison. The group murmured, their faces a mix of awe and curiosity. Miss Marple sipped her tea, continuing. Mrs. Finch was more complex. Her rivalry with Eleanor over the apple pie contest was the talk of the village, and her claim of a sisterly tea at her cottage was insistent, too insistent. She denied using Eleanor's chipped teacup, always mentioning her fine china. But her gardening knowledge, particularly of apple seeds, was troubling. The chemist confirmed that cyanide could be extracted from them, and Lydia's roses suggested such skill. Yet her lies were those of a gossip, not a killer. Her tea story was a nervous fabrication, not a confession. A villager, old Mr. Gibbs, spoke up, his voice gruff. "What about Dr. Hale? That debt in Eleanor's ledger, £50, and he was near the orchard." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes narrowing. Dr. Hale was a strong suspect. His ambition for the clinic clashed with Eleanor's protests, and the debt pressed hard. A vial like those in his clinic was found near old Bessie, and a nurse saw him near the orchard gate, not Mrs. Carter's cottage as he claimed. His knowledge of chemistry made cyanide plausible, but his alibi, though shaky, held when I checked with Mrs. Carter's neighbor, who saw him leave her cottage later. His debt was a motive, but not the act. I recalled a solicitor whose debts led to theft, not murder. Mrs. Clements poured more tea, her hand steadier now. "So it was Beatrice all along. How did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, her thoughts weaving back to the clues. Beatrice Quill was the quiet one, always in Eleanor's shadow. She was trusted, sharing tea in that chip, recalled the housemaid, unassuming but desperate, who betrayed her mistress for less. Beatrice's nervousness, her trembling hands, her evasion about the teacup, they were signs of guilt, not grief. Mrs. Clements sighed, her eyes misty. That poor girl. To think Eleanor trusted her. "Trust," Miss Marple said, "is a fragile thing, like a teacup's rim." Eleanor's kindness was her strength, but also her vulnerability. Beatrice exploited that trust, and the orchard hid her act until the clues spoke. Reverend Clements rubbed his chin. "The vial, the diary, the stick. How did you sort through so many distractions?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "False scents are common in a village, Reverend. The vial was likely planted by Beatrice to point to Hale. The diary's fresh ink betrayed its purpose. The stick was too convenient, like a prop in a play. But the teacup, the footprint, the letter, they were intimate, pointing to someone close. Beatrice mentioned the cup fondly, a detail only a confidant would know. The footprint's direction was too precise for coincidence. The group sat in silence, the fire's crackle a soft underscore to their thoughts. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind settling. "The village is a garden," she said, "and every garden has its weeds. Weeding them out restores the balance." Mrs. Clements offered a scone, her smile warm. "You've brought us peace, Miss Marple. St. Mary Mead owes you a great deal." Miss Marple waved a hand, her smile modest. "I only watch, my dear, as one does with roses. The truth grows if you give it light." As the gathering dispersed, Miss Marple stepped into the crisp morning, the village green sparkling with dew. The orchard's apples ripened under the sun, and the schoolhouse stood quiet, its new teacher preparing to heal its wounds. She returned to her cottage, where Florence had a fresh pot brewing. Settling by the fire, she resumed her knitting, the needles click a gentle rhythm.